B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, July 20th, 2020. Happy birthday to my little brother, Gus. The federal siege of Portland by stormtroopers dispatched by Donald Trump and Attorney General Bill Barr continues at this hour. Despite the intervention of a wall of moms and a naked woman who has been dubbed Athena. So over the weekend, as we reported on Friday, and I am pleased to see that the corporate media has picked up this important story, because it does pose a threat of totalitarian intervention by the federal government in local law enforcement affairs. And Trump, here on Monday, is threatening to expand his deployment of these heavily armed federal law enforcement officers to other cities run by Democratic mayors. It shows the pure partisanship, clear and simple. So over the weekend, the protests continued, and there was sporadic efforts by these federal agents who are based in a federal building, and they would sally forth, engage in interactions with protesters involving stun guns, non-lethal rounds, and tear gas. Trump described the unrest in Portland as a national threat involving anarchists and agitators. But that's not really true. There have been ongoing protests for 53 days now. There has been some vandalism. And inartfully at times, the mayor of Portland has given Trump some of the language to describe these demonstrations. And yes, there are a handful of anti-fascists, self-described, who are on the scene there. But it is primarily a continuation of the George Floyd protests, with some local flavor and demands of local authorities to cut police funding and take steps to change pivotal policies. And Trump went on Twitter Sunday to say that his goons were trying to help Portland, not hurt it. He says the local authorities are missing in action. We must protect federal property and our people. Now, let's take his words literally here. The federal government, through the president and the executive branch, has the legal authority to protect federal property. But these stormtroopers are policing the streets of Portland, not just the area adjacent to the Hatfield Federal Building. And this is a clear violation. I don't know if the word sovereignty is accurate here, but that's how I interpret it. He is bigfooting the people who are actually in charge and have jurisdiction over this scene. And he's doing it to provide pictures to Fox News that feed the fantasies of many of his supporters, that what we need is a good dose of authoritarianism, a crackdown from a fascist leader, a police state to prevent First Amendment protesters from exercising their rights because a handful of them break the law. And I want to quote Charles P. Pierce. He put out some good words in Esquire over the weekend. He said, "Why in the hell is this not a bigger story? A major American city is being softly Pinochet'd in broad daylight." He's referring to the strongman of Chile, who Nixon intervened to support in the coup that overthrew Salvador Allende. Pierce continues, "If we know one thing, If this president and his administration get away with this, it will only get worse. You'd have to be out of your mind or comatose since the fall of 2016 not to suspect that this could be a dry run for the kind of general urban mobilization at which the president has been hinting since this summer's protests began. And he quotes the governor, Democrat Kate Brown, who called the visit by the acting Director of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, political theater from President Trump, said Trump is looking for a confrontation in Oregon in the hopes of winning political points in Ohio or Iowa. Again, Charles Pierce, since when does a cabinet official, and let me add an acting one, representing the president, come to a city and not even try to meet the mayor? Since 2017, of course. Brown is right. This is a dumb show for dummies in the base. But it's also a terrible look into that of which this administration is capable, and for which this administration seems to be softening the ground. Wolf is certainly on board. He put out a release that reads like Eisenhower's exhortation before the ships left for Normandy. And then Pierce asks, what are these marauding tribes up to? And he lists 3 days, May 30th, June 1st, June 2nd. And all of the listings are violent anarchists graffitied the BPA building, the Hatfield Courthouse, the Edith Green Wennell Wyatt building, the Terry Shrunk Plaza, the 9/11 Federal building, the Pioneer Courthouse, the Gus Solomon Courthouse. You get the idea. And, with tongue-in-cheek, he says 2 more dirty words on the side of a building, and Wolf might be calling in airstrikes. Now, we can't rule out the drones are not being used in this situation, not the armed ones, we can hope. And on Thursday, Trump's press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, took a moment out of her briefing to call Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot a renegade mayor because Lightfoot refuses to ask for the National Guard to come to her city. And Pierce closes with this. Portland may be a dumb show for dummies, but it also looks like a dress rehearsal. This is not an authoritarian impulse. This is authoritarian government, straight, no chaser. And this administration has a powerful thirst for it. It will do anything if it thinks it can get away with it in order to benefit a president who wants to bring the republic down on his head. Unmarked vehicles, disappearing people off the street. He says, we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission now before the dress rehearsal becomes a roadshow. Well, I don't think we have time for any kind of commission, Mr. Pierce. We need the federal courts to intervene and put a stop to this right now. And we've had some strong statements, mostly from Democratic leaders in Oregon, backed up by a few Democratic chairs, like the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler. But we need every member of Congress to pipe up and threaten to cut off funding to the Department of Homeland Security, which has the overarching responsibility for these federal stormtroopers that are drawn from the Bureau of Prisons, from a strike force of the Immigration Department. And a lot of media attention has been focused on a veteran, a Navy veteran from the Naval Academy, a former member of the Seabees, the Civil Engineer Corps, 53-year-old Christopher David. He took the bus to downtown Portland on Saturday night, and he wanted to know what the officers involved thought of the oath that he had taken and that they took to protect and defend the Constitution. So Christopher David went to the scene, and he didn't find much. He was about to leave, and then the federal goons emerged. They rushed a line of protesters nearby, knocking them to the ground. David walked toward a gap in the line, calling out to the officers, "Why are you not honoring your oath? Why are you not honoring your oath to the Constitution?" An officer trained his weapon on David's chest as several agents pushed him, sending him stumbling backward. But he kept his balance. He tried again. Another agent raised his baton and began to beat David, who stood unwavering with his arms at his side. Then another officer unloaded a canister of chemical irritant spray, probably pepper spray, into his face. Blinded by this, he retreated from the scene, found his way to a park bench, and a street medic helped him, then took him to the hospital, where Christopher David discovered that his right hand had been broken badly in 2 places by the men he simply asked about their oath to the Constitution. So today, Trump said that the federal agents that he sent to Portland have done a fantastic job. And he hinted that he's ready to deploy similar forces in other cities. Now, this is mission creep of the worst sort. And it shows me that Trump, who is trying to rebrand as President Law and Order, and as I've said, he's drawing on Nixon with a touch of George Wallace, the racism part. And he didn't include any further hints. He usually tips his hand big time. But Chicago does seem to be a likely target for his plan to send in the troops. And I'll remind you, back in 1968, when the police rioted in Chicago at the scene of the Democratic National Convention, which was converged on by many different anti-war protesters, it was boss Mayor Daley who infamously malapropped, "The police are here to preserve disorder." And that's what Trump is actually doing. Because by all accounts of Portland and Oregon officials, he has made the situation worse. He has united the protesters with some of the elected leaders who were trying to tell them to go away. And then we learn that Trump is being advised by John Yoo, Y-O-O. Do you remember him? He was the lawyer in the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, who created the legal rationale for torture and for very expansive ideas of presidential power. John Yoo has a book due out next week called Defender-in-Chief, and he argues that Trump is restoring the powers of the presidency envisioned by the framers of the Constitution. And lately, he interprets the Supreme Court ruling that held that Trump improperly tried to cancel the DACA program that had been set up under executive order by Barack Obama. And I haven't been exposed to his legal ramblings, but Yoo has suggested the president could declare a national right to carry firearms openly in conflict with many state laws. He could declare that he would not enforce federal firearms laws, and that a new Trump permit would free any holder of state and local gun control restrictions. The parallel is that Obama's DACA order negated not local laws, but federal laws to give relief to the so-called Dreamer Group. Now, I'm not legally qualified to argue all this at the level of the Supreme Court, but it smells like bullshit to me. Another quote from Johnny Yoo, who has a lifetime position at the law school at the University of California, Berkeley. He said, even if Trump knew that his scheme lacked legal authority, he could get away with it for the length of his presidency. And moreover, even if courts declared the permit illegal, his successor would have to keep enforcing the program for another year or two. And the ever-reliable Alan McLeod, publishing at Mint Press News, sets the scene there in Portland. The group of local moms dressed in white and yellow calling themselves the Wall of Moms, chanting, "Feds stay clear, moms are here." And they were met with tear gas, flashbangs, and pepper round bullets, injuring many of them. McLeod writes, Oregon's largest city has been the site of particularly intense struggles over the past week, as the Trump administration has tried to neutralize ongoing demonstrations that began in late May. Federal agents were deployed. Viral video shows masked anonymous units emerging from an unmarked minivan, abducting people off the street randomly. He tells the story I just shared about Christopher David. He says Homeland Security has justified its actions, claiming that violent anarchists have taken over and destroyed the city, although the only examples of destruction were stone throwing, graffiti, and a broken fence. And so the rhetoric of Trump and his minions does not match the reality on the ground. They're making this shit up. And there are enough people who will believe it because Trump has tweeted it, because he is their president. And the ACLU issued a statement. Federal agents are terrorizing the community, threatening lives, relentlessly attacking protesters, demonstrating against police brutality. This is not law and order. This is lawlessness, and it must be stopped. So they filed a lawsuit. And the ACLU's Doug Brown is quoted, "I've been documenting violent and militarized police responses to protests in Portland for more than 4 years. Nothing prepared me for the unrestrained brutality I've witnessed and experienced in recent days. While some federal officers had already been in the streets, we now have additional militarized special ops officers occupying the streets of downtown Portland, bent on inflicting pain and terror on people who believe Black Lives Matter." And then there is the naked Athena. She certainly got a lot of attention on social media. But about 2 o'clock in the morning, Saturday night, Sunday, a young woman who has a very attractive figure based on my eyeballs, she entered an intersection wearing a hat and a face mask. She's observing COVID rules. And from the video I saw, she seemed to have some covering over her crotch. But she walked out to the intersection. She did some ballet poses. She laid on the ground with her legs open. And she has been dubbed the Naked Athena. And by the way, there is a history, in fact, it's been endorsed by courts, of protesters getting naked to send their message in Portland, Oregon. There was a guy who completely disrobed in protest of airport security a few years ago, and a judge ruled in his favor. It was not considered indecent exposure. I've been surprised at some of the females in my Facebook feed who found that to be inappropriate. I think it was a powerful message. She appeared to escape unscathed and undressed. And I, for one, don't find it so prurient. I guess I'm just not Puritan enough for many Americans today. So on Thursday, when Chad Wolf, the acting Secretary of Homeland Security, and I just have to pause to say that years after that name was selected for the combined department that put all of these different agencies under one roof, I still despise the term Homeland. Ugh, it is so Germanic. Anyway, somebody leaked a memo to the New York Times, a memo prepared by Homeland Security for its acting boss, Chad Wolf. And an unnamed person wrote, "Moving forward, if this type of response is going to be the norm, specialized training and standardized equipment should be deployed to responding agencies. Well, what this tells us is that this is just a group of different agency enforcement people who were slapped together, flown into Portland, and told to create photo ops. Prosecutors have opened a criminal investigation into the injury of one of the protesters. That's the guy who was shot in the eye because he was brandishing a speaker. Mayor Ted Wheeler, who also serves as the local police commissioner, and I've scratched my head about that before. I don't know how you can do both jobs. But he is now embracing the protesters in opposition to the federal intervention. But Wheeler himself has been the target of protest, with crowds at times gathering outside of his residence, a condo. For weeks, he's called for an end to destructive demonstrations, saying he was concerned about, quote, groups who continue to perpetrate violence and vandalism on our streets. And it's that language that I think has incited Trump to act in the dictatorial manner that he has chosen. So, 2 Republican members of the Senate, Lindsey Graham, chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, quote, President Trump is right to demand that law and order be restored in American cities. These protests and riots are getting out of hand, jeopardizing public safety and economic recovery. If federal law enforcement officials are necessary to do the job and President Trump chooses to go down this path, I completely support him. Well, thanks, Lindsey. Head of the Judiciary Committee. Read the Constitution lately, dude? And Rand Paul is a guy I can only support about 3 or 4 days a year, but this is one of them. The senator from Kentucky, we cannot give up liberty for security. Local law enforcement can and should be handling these situations in our cities, but there is no place for federal troops or unidentified federal agents rounding up people at will. Good for you, Rand. Now we fly a few hundred miles north to Seattle and get our latest report from correspondent Jonah Leto. Seattle protests have grown in numbers in response to the events in Portland receiving national attention. It's included statements by Trump officials that the Portland model will be used as a model nationally. However, as previously reported here on Peter B. Collins, feds, specifically the FBI and possibly others, were already used to clear the Capitol Hill protest zone in Seattle on July 1st. Reporting on events in Portland, the Seattle Times now reports that feds were sent to Seattle under the same mobilization model as Portland prior to July 4th, but they have since allegedly been withdrawn. And Jonah comments, it appears to be confirmed that the clearing of the CHOP was the first major action involving feds nationally. From demonstrations yesterday, Seattle police report that the East Precinct experienced a small fire from a large mortar-type firework thrown into the building. However, footage of the firework reveals the device was more like a firecracker. Nevertheless, unconfirmed police sources continue to allege and report that the device was mortar-like in design. Police also allege that a distinct subgroup of protesters broke away from one of the 2 main demonstrations yesterday, used baseball bats and broke big-box store windows, engaged in graffiti. The baseball bats are unconfirmed, and it's also unconfirmed whether this very organized small group were even actual protesters. And in the show file for the podcast, you will find Jonah's report as a link, and inside the report there's a link to a police statement that is available on YouTube. And he continues, an opinion column in the Seattle Times by writer Naomi Ishizaka is now calling for police reports to achieve the same scrutiny as any other reports, citing a history of falsity. For example, in the police killing of Manuel Ellis, his state was described as a type of excited delirium, but numerous critics have called the use of this term pseudoscience and dishonest. Citing another example, on June 11th, Seattle police reported that fees were being required to enter the former Capitol Hill occupied protest zone and referred to this as a crime of extortion. On the following day, Police Chief Carmen Best was forced to admit there was no evidence of extortion or any similar crime in the area of CHOP. Historically, police can report by tweets or blotter entries what allegedly occurred at an alleged crime scene or active investigation, with little scrutiny or evidence being provided, and without using the usual qualifiers applied to other sources of information like alleged or according to unconfirmed reports. And in other news, Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkan is alleging that the city council's ban on crowd control weapons cannot go into effect without the approval process set forth in the federal consent decree, which goes back 6 or 8 years. As the former federal prosecutor, Durkan negotiated this decree. Among other things, at several points, this process calls for police voices to be heard. The decree's procedures will delay the implementation of the council's ban until those accused of wrongdoing and found by a unanimous council vote to have abused the weapons they were provided with can be heard, even though police had ample opportunity to lobby the city council. It appears from Jonah's perspective that the decree is being used procedurally to enhance police chances to commit the very police brutality it is supposedly designed to limit. And as in Portland, the feds can and have been brought in to circumvent any limitations put on local police by their elected Democratic representatives by having the feds use the prohibited weapons. In a brazen attack on the judiciary, a federal judge in New Jersey, Judge Esther Salas, who, among other cases, has been presiding over the settlement of wrongdoing with Deutsche Bank for its managing of the funds of Jeffrey Epstein. So yesterday afternoon, about 5:30 local time, a man who appeared to be a FedEx delivery person showed up at the door. The judge's 20-year-old son, Daniel Andrel, was shot with a single bullet to his heart and declared dead on the scene. His father approached the door, Mark Andrel, age 63, and was shot multiple times. The judge was reported to have been in the basement of the house. She ran upstairs when she heard screams and gunshots. She was uninjured, and the assailant apparently was able to run away. It's not known if Judge Salas or that Mr. Andrel, who is a defense lawyer, a criminal lawyer, it's not known who the intended victim was, at least not at this point. And early today, federal agents and police announced that a lawyer, so far who has not been named, was found dead by a self-inflicted gunshot wound about 2 hours away from the New Jersey home where the shooting occurred. The lawyer's body was found in Sullivan County in New York State, and since we don't have his identity at this point, we can't go much further. But Whitney Webb, the talented journalist who has appeared on this podcast a couple of times, she has tweeted that she has a story that will be out soon, probably later today, that should shed some light on the details of this case and the motivation of the shooter. And once again, I cite the excellent reporter at Mint Press News, Alan McLeod, because related to the Epstein case and the recent arrest of Ghislaine Maxwell, he did a little analysis of the media coverage on the two partisan cable channels. And it won't surprise you to learn that the data clearly show that on Fox News, they repeatedly play up the connection that Epstein had with Bill Clinton and play down his long-running friendship with Donald Trump. And, again, no shock, at MSNBC, 45 mentions of Donald Trump's links to Jeffrey Epstein and only 19 to Bill Clinton. And as McLeod explains, many of the references to Clinton on MSNBC are just in passing. And likewise, many of the references to Trump on Fox are cursory, and then they return to the partisan focus. McLeod points out that one of the victims, Virginia Roberts, also known as Virginia Giuffre, starts with a G. Well, when she got recruited by Ghislaine Maxwell to give sexual massages to Jeffrey Epstein, she was working for Trump at Mar-a-Lago. And so when you discount the passing mentions, on MSNBC it's 15-2, Trump over Clinton, and on Fox News it's 13-1, Clinton over Trump. I want to commend Joe Laria, Scott Ritter, and my good friend Ray McGovern. On Friday, I shared with you a report that ended up in the New York Times Sunday magazine under the byline of a Robert Draper. And Draper has a new book coming out called To Start a War, How the Bush Administration Took America into Iraq. And in the article, he goes to great lengths to try to sanitize and reform the reputation of Colin Powell, who was Bush's Secretary of State, who made the infamous speech to the United Nations on February 5th of 2003, talking about mobile weapons labs, showing a little, glass tube that he said was anthrax, and painting the picture that there was evidence that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction in defiance of all the sanctions, and there was no choice but to go to war with or without UN approval. Well, let's start with Scott Ritter. He discloses that he was a source for Draper in the book. And he says he believes that his words carried very little weight with Draper based on this excerpt from the book. And Ritter says, I spent some time articulating to Draper my contention that the issue with Iraq was never about weapons of mass destruction, but rather regime change, and that everything had to be viewed in the light of this reality, including Powell's UN speech. Based on the content of his article, I might as well have been talking to a brick wall, says Ritter. And so he goes into some detail about his role as a weapons inspector, about some of his contacts with Colin Powell. He shares an exchange where Ritter was quoted in the media to Colin Powell, Ritter saying that there was no evidence that Saddam had these WMD. So here's a quote. This is September 8th, 2002. And Ritter said, the rhetoric of fear that is disseminated by my government and others has not to date been backed up by hard facts that substantiate any allegations that Iraq is today in possession of weapons of mass destruction or has links to terror groups responsible for attacking the United States. Void of all facts, all we have is speculation. So when Powell was confronted with this, his response, we have facts, not speculation. Scott is certainly entitled to his opinion, but I'm afraid that I would not place the security of my nation and the security of our friends in the region on that kind of an assertion by somebody who's not in the intelligence chain any longer. If Scott is right, then why are they keeping the inspectors out? If Scott is right, why don't they say anytime, any place, anywhere? And the retort from Ritter, in November 2002, Iraq did just what Powell said they would never do. They let the UN inspectors return without preconditions. And what he is pointing out is that the Draper article attempts to show that Colin Powell was tortured by all this, that he didn't believe the lies he was being fed by the CIA, but he dutifully repeated them to a worldwide audience in the critical speech that occurred just, 40-some days before Bush launched the shock and awe campaign to invade Iraq. Then there's Ray McGovern, the guy who was chair, when he worked at the CIA, of the National Intelligence Estimate Committee. And he talks about the open letters from the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, which started by encouraging Bush not to listen to the CIA and not to invade Iraq. And so he, in a fairly personal way, confronts Colin Powell and the revisionism that he is attempting through the book and the excerpted article by Robert Draper. And then there's Joe Laria, who is the editor-in-chief at Consortium News, and I consider him a friend and a man I deeply respect. And he tells you his first-person account. He was at the United Nations as a journalist on the day that Powell gave that speech. And while he watched it on video, he had taken a moment to go and observe the packed chamber where Powell delivered the lies that led us into war. And he quotes a critical part of Draper's article, saying, what if Colin Powell had had a moral compass? What if he had had the guts to stand up to Bush and Tenet and Rumsfeld and Cheney and to say, this is a pack of lies, and I will not deliver it for you? Quoting Draper, what if he had said no to Bush when he asked him to speak before the UN? Powell would almost certainly have been obligated to resign, and many, if not all, of his top staff members involved in the Iraq issue would also have quit. And that kind of a dramatic move could have changed the course of history. And so I have no sympathy for Colin Powell. He's now 80 or a little more, and he appears to want to cleanse his conscience. Well, this isn't enough not for me anyway. Here's today's COVID-19 daily update, prepared with my gratitude by Linda Lewis. The worldwide count of cases now is at 14.5 million, with a reported 607,000 deaths and 8 million recoveries. In the United States, 3.7 million cases, 140,536 deaths, 1.1 million recoveries, 45 million people tested, 458,000 new cases just last week, and 56,000 long-term care deaths. That's nursing homes and similar facilities. Axios has a series of charts illustrating trends in COVID-19 hospitalizations for each state. Arizona is worst off, with 24% of all hospital beds filled with COVID-19 patients. Next worst is Texas, 19%, Nevada, 18%. Intensive care units are completely full in portions of Arizona, Florida, Mississippi, and Texas. Trump had a testy interview with Chris Wallace on his formerly favorite news channel, Fox, on Sunday. It was recorded on Friday. And, of course, Trump is always testy. He's always angry. That's the only mood he has. And he went off on Chris Wallace very early in the interview, repeating his irrational statement that cases are up because we have the best testing and we have the most testing. And for a Fox guy, Chris Wallace gives a pretty tough interview to their man. So a group called STAT challenged the idea that more testing creates more cases. In only 7 states was the rise in reported cases from mid-May to mid-July driven primarily by increased testing. In the other 26 states, Among the 33 that saw cases increase during that period, the case count rose because there was actually more disease. Florida, for example, has seen a 7-fold increase in cases in the past month. In the same time span, the number of tests only increased by a factor of 2. So tests doubled, positives went up by 7x. Obviously, if you double the testing but the number of cases increased 7-fold, then the virus is clearly spreading. The number of people signing up for food stamps grew by 17% from February to May, about 3 times faster than in any previous quarter. About 3.3 million adults 65 or older live in households with school-age children, which is a factor in Trump's effort to force all schools to reopen for classroom teaching, not remote learning. And he seems to think that those kids live in some sort of isolated bubble. And looking another way, 4.1 million school-age children, 7% between the ages of 5 and 18, live in a household with somebody 65 or older. While nearly half of older adults living with a school-age child are white, older people of color are significantly more likely to live with a school-age child compared to their white counterparts. Colorado's governor, Democrat Jared Polis, blamed delays in coronavirus test results on the national testing system. Quote, "The national testing scene is a complete disgrace. So every test we send out to private lab partners nationally, 7 days, 8 days, 9 days, maybe 6 days if we're lucky, almost useless from an epidemiological or even diagnostic perspective. And I'll add to that, here in California, where we appear to be handling the increased cases pretty well, a friend of mine went to submit a sample for a COVID-19 test, and it took a full 7 days for the results to be returned. And this has led to a breakdown in contact tracing as well. Well, Americans are not welcome in Europe, most of South America. But if you've got a yacht or your own plane, the Bahamas will welcome you. If you try to come on a commercial airliner, you won't be allowed in. But they're making an exception for wealthy cruise-type people. And this is the worst news of the day. Apparently based on some rantings by Kellyanne Conway last week, Trump has announced that he will resume presiding over the daily coronavirus briefings starting Tuesday at 5 p.m. It'll be on a TV near you, so you've been warned. Leave the room or you can turn it off. And this is such idiocy because all Trump does is attack the media. And nobody can control him, at least not people on his staff. And how anybody believes that this is going to help his reelection prospects is well beyond me. Now, I often confess to you that on the way to work, I punch up Rush Limbaugh on the radio just to see what he's talking about. And I missed this one last Wednesday. Limbaugh warned Americans they should get used to living with coronavirus and urged his audience to adapt to the pandemic like the Donner Party did. Now, I've been through Donner Pass many times. It's one of the beautiful routes from California to Nevada through the Sierra Nevada mountains. And there's a railroad line that goes through there, and I've often thought about the Donner Party. They're the ones who got trapped there by heavy snow one winter, and they were left to cannibalize one another. So for Rush, this is the guy who's dying of cancer. I believe he's at stage 4. So he told his listeners it was so bad they had to turn to cannibalism to survive. That's what's noteworthy about the Donner Party. They didn't complain about it because there was nothing they could do. Well, how does he know they didn't complain about it? And so this invocation of the Donner Party is sick, twisted, irrelevant, irrational, tasteless. All right, one more. Inexplicable. Researchers in Britain say that an initial test has shown that a new drug called SNG-001, which is delivered by inhaler and based on interferon beta, a protein produced naturally in the body, is showing some promise with COVID-19 patients. Now, first, we've got to issue the caveat here. Here's a caution warning from experts. This trial is too small to draw firm conclusions. The headline reduction in progression to severe disease comes with a huge statistical uncertainty. It is good to see new treatments being developed, but there's a big difference between encouraging early results and definitive evidence that transforms clinical practice. So they say that when it was used, that the death rate was reduced by 79% among those given the drug compared to those given a placebo. Patients were given it for up to 14 days with post-treatment data collected on days 15 and 16, and patients further tracked up to day 28. Over the course of the trial, 3 patients in the placebo group died, and there were no deaths among those given SNG-001. And speaking of the prospects of treatments or a vaccine, over the weekend, the New York Times did a fairly unemotional, uncharged review of public attitudes about taking a COVID-19 vaccine. It's the fairest article on people who are concerned about vaccine safety. It doesn't descend into anti-vaxxer language or lumping people all together. In fact, let me quote. They cite a retired 4th grade teacher in Fairbanks, Alaska, Joanne Barnes. The bottom line is I have absolutely no faith in the FDA and in the Trump administration. She said she's otherwise scrupulously up to date on getting her shots. I just feel like there's a rush to get a vaccine out, so I'm very hesitant. And the article continues here in paragraph 4. Mistrust of vaccines has been on the rise in the U.S. in recent years, a sentiment that resists categorization by political party, educational background, or socioeconomic demographics. It has been fanned by a handful of celebrities, but now anti-vaccine groups are attracting a new type of clientele altogether. Later in the article, they note, this month, a nationwide task force of 23 epidemiologists and vaccine behavior specialists released a detailed report saying that work is urgent. They note that Operation Warp Speed, the $10 billion public-private partnership that is driving much of the vaccine research, rests upon the compelling yet unfounded presupposition that if we build it, they will come. Quoting the report from Johns Hopkins, if poorly designed and executed, a COVID-19 vaccination campaign in the U.S. could undermine the increasingly tenuous belief in vaccines and the public health authorities that recommend them, especially among people most at risk of COVID-19 impacts. So this is an important development because while I am generally pro-vaccine and I've had vaccines and my stepson is vaccinated, I am not, 100% opposed to vaccination. But I have been, I would say my mind has been opened by the efforts to force 100% participation, forcing parents under penalty of law or penalty of not being allowed to enroll their kids in school to submit their children to vaccination. There's a fundamental human choice here, in my view. And there are also rational arguments as to why people are either hesitant or refusing to participate in vaccination. And I refuse to join the mob mentality and just say, well, science is right. You're so shut up and roll up your sleeves and let us jab you. In other COVID-related news, United Airlines said Monday it will step up air filtration as passengers board and disembark, and Delta Airlines has started screening travelers unable to wear masks because of health conditions. So when you hear the airlines say that they're going to step up your access to fresh air, this has always been a complaint of mine. And on the old Continental Airlines, who absorbed that? Maybe Delta? See, I can't even remember. But I used to fly them on a regular basis, and I would always get a sinus infection. And I blamed it on the lack of clean air. And, of course, clean air costs money at altitude because it's part of a system that uses fuel. So, as of right now, you can fly on Delta or Southwest, where the middle seat will remain empty. United is not capping the number of passengers on its flights. It says such policies are just marketing strategies. And American is also not limiting the number of passengers on its flights. So if you want a slim margin of better safety, try Delta and Southwest, at least until the end of September. In Florida, teachers' unions are suing the governor over his order requiring schools to open, despite the fact that the state of Florida doesn't meet the numerical standards for testing, the rate of results, hospitalizations, and deaths. Public health experts have said that districts should consider reopening only if they're in a region with a positive test rate at 5% or below. And in Florida's populous Miami-Dade County, the positivity rates are over 20%. As we mentioned earlier, there are many households where school-aged children live with vulnerable adults like their grandparents. And the idea that we should just ignore all that and open up the schools despite the risk, despite the cost, it's pretty stunning. There's a powerful speech delivered in Johannesburg over the weekend by the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. This was the Mandela speech, honoring the birthday of Nelson Mandela, who died in 2013. And just two quick quotes. It's a powerful speech. He says, COVID-19 is like an X-ray, revealing fractures in the fragile skeleton of the societies we have built. It is exposing fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. The lie that free markets can deliver health care for all. The fiction that unpaid care work is not work. The delusion that we live in a post-racist world. The myth that we are all in the same boat. He said developed countries are strongly invested in their own survival and have failed to deliver the support needed to help the developing world through these times. And that mentality is reflected by the Republicans in the Senate, who have been delayed. They're finally getting around to putting together the next relief package from Washington. And while the House Democrats passed a $3 trillion package that they call the HEROES Act, that has some good elements like bailout money for state and local government, hospitals, etc. It's got some shitty stuff in there, too. Well, the Republicans, their bill's almost all shitty. They want to cut the payroll tax, which will immediately impact the revenues that flow to Social Security and Medicare, and provide $5 a week in the pocket of the average employee who's actually gone back to work. They also want to cut the unemployment, the federal bonus amount, which is currently $600, and you can thank Bernie Sanders for that, because they think it's a bad idea that some Americans are making more on unemployment when they did when they were working. And this will prevent them from going back to work. No, what prevents people from going back to work is the risk to get sick. And once again, the Republicans ignore the real issues that drive the behavior of Americans. They're going to ram through legislation or language that will prevent any lawsuits against employers, against the operators of public facilities. They're going to provide zero liability for the people with money who get sued by the people who don't have money. And the legislation is also expected to omit new aid for cities and states that the Democrats badly want, allowing governors and local leaders more flexibility to spend the $150 billion already allocated. Well, California alone needs $40 or $50 billion for this fiscal year alone. And so there's going to be a huge fight. And, of course, it happens as the clock is running because the unemployment benefits expire at the end of this week. Now, they're talking about another $1,200 payment to certain Americans, $70 billion for elementary and secondary schools, but only if they agree to Trump's threats and open all classrooms for the fall semester. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin says told lawmakers that the administration will be looking for more funding for the Paycheck Protection Program. So be prepared for a nasty battle on Capitol Hill this week. Well, the New York Times continues to cling to the fiction it published under the Russiagate narrative. And in a cocktail Zoom engagement over the weekend, I had trouble convincing my buddy Dave that this is a threat to his dream that Biden is going to beat Trump in November. Because I think they're setting the stage with Lindsey Graham helping out, with Bill Barr and the Durham investigation. Rudy Giuliani's going to come back in the frame. Trump has hinted and tweeted about Obamagate. And they're going to try to make hay with this, exposing the media fraud of the Russiagate reporting that was so much based on anonymous sources and leaks. So Peter Strzok, you remember him, one of the top dogs at the FBI. He ran the Hillary Clinton email investigation. Then he was detailed to the Russia investigation, and he ultimately was fired. It was exposed he was having an affair with an FBI lawyer, Lisa Page. But Peter Strzok made some marginal notes in a document which called into question the credibility of the Steele dossier. And this was as early as January or February of 2017. And the renewal of warrants at the FISA court to surveil Carter Page based on the Steele dossier continued. And whether you think I'm crazy or whether you believe the Mueller report from St. Bob, I believe that the Russia investigation will be exposed. And this will give Trump the ability to spring back, to rebuild his poll numbers, to create doubt about Joe Biden and undermine his limited popularity. Now, I also think that Hunter Biden and Ukraine will be back in time for the November election. And finally today, there have been just a whole wave of heartfelt tributes to Congressman John Lewis, who died at age 80 on Friday. He was a hero of the civil rights movement, got elected to Congress, where he really made an impression on many people. And I can't recount every aspect of his career and accomplishments, but I met John Lewis just once, and it was an event I will never forget. A guy named Bob Plath had created an organization promoting forgiveness on an international basis, and he asked me to moderate an event where Congressman John Lewis came here to California, and in public, he accepted the apology from Elwyn Wilson, Elwyn Wilson had previously gone to John Lewis to apologize in private. About 50 years after, he and some of his white friends had pulled John Lewis and companions off a bus, a Greyhound bus, on May 9th, 1961, in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Elwyn Wilson and his Klan-type buddies beat up John Lewis and his black companions. And to see these two men reconcile, and to see John Lewis have the capacity to forgive a man who had brutalized him and fought to prevent the expansion to full rights for black Americans, it moved me in a way that, well, I'll never forget. John Lewis, happy trails till we meet again. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it with absolutely everyone. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.